We called this study 400 Years of Warning, a study in the minor prophets. It's not really considered, Daniel's not really considered one of the minor prophets. And there's reasons for that, but we wanted to cover the book of Daniel. It's only 12 chapters because it is in the chronology of those minor prophets. It's in the timeline of those minor prophets who prophesied to Judah that the Babylonians were going to invade and take Judah captive. And we've come up to the point now after studying Joel, Zephaniah, and Haggai, who began prophesying 250 years plus with Joel ahead of the Babylonian invasion, walking into Zephaniah about 100 years out, walking into Haggai about 20 years out. Now into the book of Daniel, we're at 14 years old. Nebuchadnezzar finally invades after having already taxed Judah and actually physically takes Daniel and some other Hebrews, Jews, captive. So Daniel is now living in the reality that the prophets warned would come if God's people did not repent. And he's going to be one of God's men for that time. So just to kind of give you an idea of the timeline, to me it's fantastic. I mean, this is very interesting. We just got out of Habakkuk, again, who was just right before the Babylonian invasion took place. I mean, he's on the threshold of it, and he's still alive now as we come into the book of Daniel. We have every reason to believe that he was an old man who was still alive, that was among those who was probably not deported during the first deportation that took place in about 586 BC. But he's still alive. He sees this old prophet who warned that these things were going to come and who wrestled with God over, is it the right thing to use a people more wicked than us to bring judgment on us, and who landed in faith. Hey, I'm going to trust you no matter what. He now sees this has taken place, and he's going to get to see some of the development, but he's not going to be around for long. So you have Daniel at about 14 years old, 14, 15 at the most. Now, keep in mind that Jeremiah has also been prophesying. He was prophesying during the days of Habakkuk, probably began prophesying shortly, after Zephaniah's prophecies went forth. He's probably in his early 50s, right around this time. And as far as we can understand it from a good study of the Word, which is also comports with what theologians tell us, Jeremiah is still in Judea among those who've not yet been deported, and he's still prophesying. I find that very interesting because later in the book of Daniel, Jeremiah's scroll will ultimately not only be written but circulated enough for Daniel to somehow get a copy of it. And what we think that we understand pretty clearly from what the book of Daniel tells us is it was probably one of the main resources that he studied to understand from God by the Holy Spirit what was really going on. He didn't even know as he went into the captivity at 14 years old that it was going to last 70 years. He would only later learn that by reading the book of Jeremiah, which you and I have in our Bibles. But the interesting thing is Jeremiah is alive when he's alive. So it's just so cool to see this timeline. Another thing that takes place is the prophet Ezekiel. We call Ezekiel, Jeremiah, Isaiah the major prophets along with Daniel. Well, Isaiah is way before. He prophesies that Babylon will come, but way ahead of that time, he's primarily speaking to Israel and how they're going to fall at the hands of the Syrians. We've seen where Jeremiah is, prophesying primarily of the Babylonian invasion that will come, alive in Daniel's time, early 50s, But Ezekiel is probably about 25 years old at this time. Ezekiel was believed to have been deported likely at the same time as Daniel or shortly thereafter, but he doesn't have his first vision from God until about 5 years later. So by the time that Ezekiel receives his first vision, he's in Babylon at the river Kibar, and that's how his book opens, Ezekiel chapter 1. So all of these prophets are in different places. Jeremiah is back in Judea still prophesying. Daniel's 14 along with Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, the ones we call the three Hebrew children. You know, Meshach, Shadrach, and Abednego. They're all together, not only in Babylon, but they're basically in the castle. And then Ezekiel, he's just with the people that didn't get taken by the king and kind of put into the re-education camp to serve in his cabinet, but he's out there among the other cabinet. So Jeremiah is going to be used by God to encourage, prophesy, and give truth to the people still in Judea after the invasion. Ezekiel is going to be used to encourage, prophesy, and give truth and plead with the people who've already been taken captive. And Daniel is going to be right up in the king's house, basically, serving under King Nebuchadnezzar. So you can see how in God's sovereignty, he puts his men exactly where they need to be to make sure that all of his people are cared for and have a witness. And this book is one of the chief books on the sovereignty of God. I mean, this book is awesome. One of the other things to me to point out, this is so important because if you've ever heard people talk about Zach's trying to warm the waters up for Susie, so he's pouring warm water. So if you hear that sound on live stream, that is the ghetto baptismal being filled up with hot water. So one of the awesome things, if you've ever heard people talk about the prophets, the minor prophets, and say, listen, look, it says Babylon. You guys say they're talking about second coming of the Lord and, things that'll happen at the end of days, but it says Babylon, Nebuchadnezzar, Assyria, and all those things are gone by. They're already fulfilled. There's no future implication, really, that these prophets are writing about. That is so easy, that idea, to dispel when you get to Daniel, because lo and behold, the Babylonian invasion has come now. Daniel is in Babylon, and God doesn't stop speaking. He actually begins to give dreams and visions in more color and detail than ever about the wrath of God, the coming of the Lord Jesus Christ, and all of the things that will take place at the end of days, including the kingdoms that will follow Babylon, of Persia, and the Grecian kingdom and the Romans, and then kind of a revived picture of the Roman Empire, all given by Daniel. So there's major futuristic implications to Daniel's prophecy, and it underscores that everything that we've been reading in the minor prophets about the Babylonian invasion was a template for the end of days. And that's why when we get to the book of Revelation, we have several chapters dedicated exclusively to talking about Babylon, when there ain't no Babylon, and yet there is. So understand that what we're reading is prophecy fulfilled, but also prophecy yet to be fulfilled. And we can have as much confidence that the things that have yet to be fulfilled are going to be fulfilled as Daniel did, because he's living on the backside of so much of what these other men that we studied, Joel, Zephaniah, Haggai said, also Isaiah, Jeremiah, it was fulfilled. And he literally realizes, like you and I ought to, that he's living in the days, prophetic days. He learns again from Jeremiah exactly how long the captivity is going to take place. that yes, God is going to bring us out, that this kingdom is going to collapse. And most amazingly, he lives through the whole thing. He lives from Nebuchadnezzar's reign, serving in government, all the way up through the reign of King Cyrus, who gives these orders for the Jews to go back into their land, rebuild the wall, the city, and the temple. He sees all of it. It's amazing. And so we're going to kind of just take it from verse 1 and move forward. In the 3rd year of the reign of Jehoiakim, king of Judah, Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, came to Jerusalem and besieged it. So Jehoiakim doesn't have a long reign, and he starts out with the opportunity to kind of stay there, but he gets a little shifty and tries to do some things to betray and throw off the restraints of the king of Babylon by reaching out to Egypt and Assyria and places like that. And it doesn't work for him because Neb finds out and he says, okay, that's enough of that. I'm going to come, I'm going to take you, I'm going to take a bunch of stuff from the temple. And he, we'll see in a minute, gives one of his chief guys orders, hey, while you're there, pick out some guys that seem to be fairly good looking, have a good head on their shoulders, they've got wisdom and wit. Bring them on back because I've got a plan. And he puts another guy in place, Zedekiah, who kind of does the same thing and later gets his eyes poked out right after he sees all his sons killed. So Neb ain't playing. This guy is a ruthless guy, and now he's come in, and finally, all that you and I have been reading about these last several months is being fulfilled. And Daniel is personally touched by it at such a young age. Verse 2, and the Lord gave Jehoiakim, king of Judah, into his, Nebuchadnezzar's hand, with some of the articles of the house of God, which he carried into the land of Shinar to the house of his God, and he brought articles into the treasure house of his God. And I love that it starts out that way because if you were here with us last week, one of the things that we read in Habakkuk chapter 1, verse 11, was that Nebuchadnezzar would start out as the instrument of God. He would be a tool in the hand of God, a hammer in the hand of God, bringing judgment on all the world's people and ultimately bringing it upon Israel. But then his mind would change. Habakkuk 1 verse 11, and he would transgress and commit offense by ascribing the power that he had to his God. And you can see that by the time he comes in and attacks Judah, he's already come to that place where he's ascribing his success to his God. So he's not afraid to take all of these temple implements and bring them right into the house of his God. And you can see the detail of Habakkuk chapter 1 verse 11 fulfilled here in Daniel chapter 1 verse 2. And then the king instructed Ashpenaz, the master of his eunuchs, to bring some of the children of Israel and some of the king's descendants and some of the nobles, young men in whom there was no blemish, good-looking, gifted in all wisdom, possessing knowledge and quick to understand, who had ability to serve in the king's palace, and whom they might teach the language and literature of the Chaldeans. Okay? Big mistake here, ascribing power to his God. But he's thinking it's a good decision, and he's also thinking it would be really wise to continue doing with some Judean young men what we believe has been doing with all of the ethnic groups that he's conquered. And I'll get to a little bit more of that in a minute. But he ends up among these finding Daniel. Ashpenaz runs into Daniel, he runs into Hananiah, he runs into Mishael, he runs into Azariah, and he takes them with, believably, a large group of others. Some as young, maybe younger, some a little bit older, like Ezekiel, who was 25. And this shows the sovereignty of God, how he's moving people into place ahead of the Judeans experiencing the worst part of this suffering through these 70 years of captivity. And Daniel is going to be key in all of this. When these three Hebrew guys are faced with the dilemma to either fall down or worship, most of you know that story. He comes up with this rule that everybody's got to fall down and worship the statue whenever these certain musical instruments play, and they won't do it. They're dedicated to God. But it would be because of their stand, still at a very young age. By the time Daniel gets thrown in the lion's den, he's probably 80 years old. That wasn't even the king of Babylon. We're way out. But the burning fiery furnace, they just barely get into action. And the reason why that had to happen so early is because God wanted Nebuchadnezzar and the servants around him and his government people, he wanted them to know, hey, you can't just treat my people like you treat everybody else. I've got a different plan for my people. They're going through some of the same things. I know you went in there and you conquered them and you took them and made slaves of them and you're getting the taxes and they're in captivity, but you can't just treat my people like you treat everybody else. That's the point of the burning fiery furnace. So he's setting people like Daniel and these three Hebrew kids and Ezekiel in the places where he needs them to be in his sovereignty to preserve his people. And God always does that. It's a mark of his sovereign protection of his people that he's bringing into judgment or discipline. He always does it. I'll give you a couple of examples. You think about Jacob and his 12 sons and how there would be a famine that would eventually come into their land. Somebody gets sent ahead of them by the sovereignty of God years before this famine ever even gets close, by the name of who? Joseph. And what he experiences is no more fun than a 14-year-old kid being taken into captivity. He's thrown into a pit by his brothers, sold to the Midianites, ends up later, we know the story, after serving in Potiphar's house, landing himself in prison under false accusations. But as the story unfolds in God's sovereignty, there he is in a position of power when the famine's going to come, which would otherwise have wiped out the sons of Jacob and or Israel, whom God wants to preserve through this time. So God always puts certain people and things in places in his sovereignty in order to preserve his remnant and to protect his people. He does it with Moses. We find out, that eventually another Pharaoh comes on the scene who doesn't know Joseph, doesn't have any respect for Joseph. And he is satanically inspired. This order goes out where all the Hebrew kids are going to be killed. Moses is hidden. Lo and behold, ends up growing up in the courts of Pharaoh. And he's right in the position that he needs to be in years later when the oppression has reached a point upon God's people where they're finally realizing that it's not God's will for them to be in Egypt, that he has a much bigger, better plan for them. Same thing happens with Samuel. All the young sons of Eli have become wicked. Israel is following in that path. And here's this 2 or 3-year-old that ends up being separated from his mother because she's made a vow to God and living really apart from her, which is not, fun for Hannah, Samuel's mother, or for Samuel. But it would be through God putting him right in that place that there would be a prophet to stand up against the wickedness of Israel and later to disciple King David. God always puts his man in his place. I mean, you see it with Daniel, you see it with Esther. God sends key people before his people in order to preserve them. Deliverers, saviors, and they're all a type of Jesus who would ultimately come and not go into captivity for us, not go into a hole, go into prison, but who would go to the cross for us, who would face death for us first, like the Hebrew kids faced the fire first, so that he could say to the enemy, hey, your plan for my people is not going to work out like you think it is. And that's one of the things I love about the book of Daniel, is you can just see the sovereign care of God for his people through putting Daniel in the place that he does. So look at verse 4. So Ashpenaz chooses these young men, good looking, wisdom, wit, and they're supposed to serve in the king's palace. So just a couple, comments. Number one, you can see right there, the world doesn't choose like God does. Because Paul says the opposite of this. He says when God chose, he didn't choose many noble, many wise, etc., etc. But he chose the weak things, the base things, the beggarly things. Even the Messiah, the Bible tells us in Isaiah 53 that there was nothing in the way that he looked that would cause us to desire him. That he wasn't a Joseph. He wasn't a Daniel. That God chooses one that people would easily overlook. So just as a reminder here that this isn't the normal path. But why is God choosing, in this case, in a sense, someone who doesn't fit the description Paul gives in Corinthians? Not noble, not mighty, not wise, etc. Well, he does it because he knows how the world thinks. And this is how the world chooses. And Daniel may seem to have some qualities, but none of these qualities are the things that really matter. We'll read in a few scriptures later that God gives him some spiritual insight, some supernatural capabilities, spiritual gifts. And it'll be those things that God uses, things that he put within Daniel that he didn't come stock with. God made Daniel stock with ears and 2 feet, and, evidently he was pretty good to look at, and he was kind of witty, but he didn't come stock with the things that God has to put in him to make him the deliverer. But that's not how the world thinks. They think we know how to choose, we look for these qualities, hey, go pick those guys. But God had his stamp on Daniel. He had his stamp on Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. And he'd been preparing them for this day. But I want you to understand what's happening here. Verse 5 says, the king appointed for them a daily provision of his delicacies and of the wine which he drank, and 3 years of training for them, so that at the end of that time they might serve before the king. What is his purpose? Because Nebuchadnezzar is not stupid. And the king of Babylon, the enemy that we face, is not stupid. Satan is not stupid. He is very wise in a dark sense. James distinguishes 2 kinds of wisdom, and he talks about one that's earthly and sensual, and he says that it's not from God. In an earthly sense, Nebuchadnezzar was a mastermind. I mean, he's a type of the Antichrist that's to come. He was influenced by the mastermind, by Satan. And he's very wise. So what is he doing in terms of his plan? He's looking for people that have charisma, that'll be able to speak well, that are likable, and that are Jewish, because he wants to indoctrinate them in order to then use them to win the hearts of the Jewish people for himself. The whole point here is to bring them in, to re-educate them, to lavish the best that he has, his delicacies, his portion upon them, so that he can then take them and put them front and center before the Jewish people like he's doing with other races. This is what he does with all of the races of the peoples that he's conquered. He's taking them, he's training them, he's re-educating, and he's taking the cream of the crop, and then he's putting them back out there and saying, hey, man, this is the place to be, and let me help you assimilate into this culture, because it's good that we're here. This is the kingdom. And this is what the enemy does today. This is what Satan does. He takes key people in this world that he views, like Nebuchadnezzar did with them, to be the king of the crop. And he takes them and he twists them up and he educates them in all the wisdom of the world. And then he puts them out there so that they become the icons, the players. They become the famous ones, the attractive ones, the ones that people will listen to, who set trend and culture. And they direct the flow of entire societies. And this is how Satan operates. And the world follows them. And a kingdom develops with a culture and with trends around these people. So listen, it sounds a little silly and archaic, but this whole thing of the guy sold his soul to the devil. Rock musicians, actors, millionaires. That is not a joke. That is a real deal. And here what we have is a guy who the devil is trying to buy. But he's going to stand up and say, no, I can't be bought because I got something better. I serve another king and I can see beyond all this stuff. It's pretty good. But I can see beyond all of it. Because this is not about food. Daniel isn't just a vegetarian who doesn't like grape juice or wine. Daniel knows that he's come to this moment for a reason, and to keep himself strong and not to be deceived, he's going to have to discipline himself. You know, the devil loves to disciple people. Because if he can get them discipled, he's growing his church, he's growing his community, his kingdom, and he loves to put evangelists out there. And the devil's plan for Daniel and Hananiah and Azariah and Mishael was to make them his evangelist to the Jewish people. And man, we have them in the church. The enemy has pastors that are actually his evangelists, that are setting culture and trend in the church. And if you pay attention, the direction in which they're leading causes the church to flow in is away from the cross, away from holiness, away from preparation for the coming of the Lord. The enemy has never stopped. This is why the Bible tells us we're not ignorant of his devices. Some of us are. But Paul could say we're not ignorant. Why? Because we have the Word of God to allow us to peek behind the curtain and see how the enemy works. So Daniel's going to stand up against it because he can't be bought. No, verse 6, now from among those of the sons of Judah were Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Again, the enemy makes a mistake here. And that's the beauty even today. Every once in a while, you'll see this phenomenon where God allows the enemy to take a man, and the enemy's full intent is to make that man his evangelist. And he'll put him in a position, and he'll for years try to do this, but he can't do it. Now, he'll fight that man forever and forever to try to do it. But there's these times when he can't do it. And those men often become champions for God. It's a phenomenon of the sovereign care and working of God that's not just to exalt that man. It's to preserve the people of God. There are a few faithful voices out there. Not many, a few faithful voices out there that have a fame and almost a level of stardom. But we have to be very careful because most of them, that's not what's going on. They've surrendered to the enemy's tactics. Verse 7, to them the chief of the eunuchs gave names. He gave Daniel the name Belteshazzar, to Hananiah Shadrach, to Mishael Meshach, and to Azariah Abednego. Now, I'll mention real quick something I didn't mention in the way of kind of an introduction. The book of Daniel is unique as a text because it's written in both Aramaic and Hebrew. So there are 2 full chapters plus a select set of verses that are exclusively written in Aramaic, which was not only the language which the Chaldeans spoke in that day, but it was the English of that time. It was the most common language in the world. So a lot of what we're going to see in the book of Daniel is actually written in Aramaic. So these names are Babylonian names, but they're Aramaic in their origin. And there's something going on here that doesn't come out in our English text. And it's this, and I believe scholars are correct about it, that it probably wasn't actually Belteshazzar. It was probably Belshazzar. Each of these names, when given by Nebuchadnezzar, were probably taken by Daniel and these three young men and changed just enough to where most people wouldn't notice it, but Daniel knew. Later, one of Nebuchadnezzar's grandson would be named Belshazzar. See, these names, it's almost like when an American or a Westerner or some, non-Muslim raised person becomes a Muslim, they're immediately given an Islamic name because immediately they need to identify from the core of their mind as someone who has an Islamic identity, the identity of one who's submitted to Allah. And there's a similar thing going on here. Bel and Nebo and all of these names betray that the agenda here was to indoctrinate them, even with the change of the name. But the small additions that appear when you actually study the original language here show that these young men likely, like teenagers would do, took these names and adjusted them slightly. And they had this really good relationship with their boss at the time, which we'll see in a moment, who I believe probably just kind of put up with it. It may have even, to him been a little quirky. I don't know for sure. But what I do know is it doesn't appear they were content to take the names as they were actually given. And that's a little bit hidden. We won't make too much of it because of that. But it's something to mention that goes along with verse 8. But Daniel purposed in his heart that he would not defile himself with the portion of the king's delicacies, nor with the wine which he drank. So he requested of the chief of the eunuchs that he might not defile himself. Verse 9, now God had brought Daniel into favor and goodwill with the chief of the eunuchs. So the chief of the eunuchs said to Daniel, I'm afraid, my lord the king, who's appointed your food and drink. I'm afraid of him. For why should he see your faces looking worse than the young men who are your age? Then you'd endanger my head before the king. So you can see that he's got favor with this guy, and the guy wants to let him do it, but this guy is afraid that if Daniel does that it isn't the best thing, that Daniel's going to suffer by making that decision, and that it's going to show in his visage. He's not going to have the look, and he's not going to have the energy, and he's not going to be as sharp, and you're going to end up before King Nebuchadnezzar, and he's going to be like, man, why do these guys look like they've barely been eaten? And Daniel knows that what he's doing for the glory of God, because he understands, and these young men understand, I believe, with him fully, that they did this with him. He understands that there's nothing wrong with the food. That God created the food. Nebuchadnezzar didn't create the food. He created the grapes, the grape juice, wine, whatever that it came from. Neb didn't create that. But this is the best of the best. This is an incentive. This is a dangling carrot. This is a reward. This is, hey, you're in with us. Look around. The rest of the people, even Babylonians, aren't eating like this. You're being offered position and place and a salary that people would die for. And Daniel's like, no, see, I'm going to take the bed. They gave him a bed. And you're going to see in a minute, he's going to take some food from them. It's coming from them. But he's like, I'm going to have to restrain myself from that, because that even for a person who loves the Lord, that's just too much. Because if I get too used to that, oh my goodness, there's a proverb that says, give me neither riches lest I forget you, or poverty lest I curse you. And he's like, if I get too much of that, man, I may not be able to fulfill the purpose for which I breathe. So I've got to beat my body, as Paul would say, and bring it into subjection, lest after I preach to others, I myself would be cast aside or shipwrecked. And then he says to Ashpenaz, please, verse 11, so Daniel said to the steward whom the chief of the eunuchs had set over Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah, please test your servants, plural. We know it was the others, for 10 days, and let them give us vegetables to eat and water to drink, and then let our appearance be examined before you and the appearance of the young men who eat the portion of the king's delicacies, and as you see fit, so deal with your servants. So he consented with them in this matter and tested them 10 days. And this is great for Ashpenaz, but who is a picture of the struggle that people in the world that don't know Christ have oftentimes when they encounter someone who really has faith in Jesus Christ and loves the Lord and walks with God. They're afraid to stop doing things the world's way, because Satan is driven into their minds, oh man, you have faith, man, but for me to stop taking these things or stop, doing these things or protecting myself that way or making, sure that I'm set up or, just to be that vulnerable or, transparent, for me to be, man, I can't bring myself, I'm afraid. And see that a lot of times we have to remember that. We should remember that, because so much of the rebellion that we see against God is rooted in fear that the enemy has just induced, people's thinking. I mean, he's just got them in this place where they're crippled to step out and trust the Lord, with fear that if they do, things will collapse and fall apart. And so this is why salvation comes by faith. Because you will not step away from all of these fears that you have unless you truly come to believe that what God says is true and He will take care of you. And now it's going to be demonstrated, and that's what we get to do as Christians. We get to demonstrate for the world that, no, you can do it different. You can do it God's way. And I think it's so cool because He's in a balance. I mean, He could have just been like some martyr, which at 14, but He does other unimaginable things, and been like, man, I'm not serving King Nebuchadnezzar. Get me out of your school. I'll die right now. But He doesn't do that, and had He done that, it's very apparent that would not have been the will of God. He actually takes the job. Yeah, maybe they would have killed him, but still, there's been other martyrs here prior to Daniel. So he takes the job, he allows himself in this position. Ashpenaz thinks the world of him. He has the favor of this guy. He sees that he's got integrity, he's kind, he's wise. And see, that shows that Jesus says to us this. He says, Father, I don't pray that you would take them out of the world, John 17. But that you would protect them from the enemy within the world. Or as 1 John says, it would be in the world but not of the world. And there's a major difference, because a lot of Christians historically, and even some today, and this comes along usually with what I call legalism, they think that holiness is to live separate from the world in the sense of what Paul told the Colossians was wrong theology. Don't touch, don't taste, don't handle. Which Paul says, hey, you're talking about things that all perish with the using. Meaning you touch, taste, handle, then you wash your hands, go to the bathroom, and whatever chicken that, got slayed on a Zeus altar is gone now. And that's why there's in Romans 14, 1 Corinthians 7, the whole thing of, be sensitive to people, but understand that, man, God created everything in this planet for our use, but not for our abuse. He says, use this world as not abusing it. He didn't create sunsets and pineapples and hamburgers and all of these things so that you would constantly have things held out before your eyes to have to restrain yourself from. What he's called us to restrain ourselves from is approaching and using these things the way the world does. What does that mean? Getting their fulfillment in those things. We get fulfillment in God and thank God for the use of those things, whereas the world gets fulfillment of those things and denies that they're even from God in the first place. There's a major difference between trying to go out of the world and still being in the world, but just not of the world. So we test them, and look what happens here. Thus the steward, verse 14, consented with them in this matter and tested them 10 days. And at the end of the 10 days, their features appeared better and fatter in flesh than all the young men who ate the portion of the king's delicacies. So the steward took away the portion of the delicacies and the wine that they were to drink and gave them vegetables. And as for these 4 young men, God gave them knowledge, skill in all literature and wisdom. And Daniel had understanding in all visions and dreams. See, God would personally assist them. They received gifts from God to be used in the position that God sovereignly brought them into. As for these 4 young men, God gave them. That's what you need to remember. They didn't come equipped with it. Verse 18, now at the end of the days, when the king had said that they should be brought into the chief of the eunuchs, 3 years into the days, when the king had said that they should be brought in, the chief of the eunuchs brought them in before Nebuchadnezzar, and the king interviewed them, and among all of them, none was found like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah. Therefore they served before the king, and in all matters of wisdom and understanding about which the king examined him, he found them 10 times better than all the musicians and astrologers who were in all his realm. So there's a theme there. And it's super simple, and we're just going to close with it. So they go through the food test, and they're 10 times fatter. Okay? That's a way of saying they look 10 times more healthy. But it's not just a food test, because they're trained throughout the 3-year process with all of the same informations and education pieces that everyone was trained with. And when they come before the king, not only had they appeared 10 times more healthy, they're 10 times wiser, wittier, smarter, more well-spoken. God did that. And what this says is super simple, but I just think that it's something to close out with and hang on to. Doing it God's way as opposed to the world's way is 10 times better in the end. You may not have been able to tell. The examination didn't come for 3 years. But in the end, though it is difficult at times to resist temptation, the Lord will be with you. And if you continue faithfully trusting Him and doing it His way, you will see that it's 10 times better. Now, the word 10 there, you understand it in this language to be almost like an idiom. Like, you had a car and you sold it, and the Lord blessed you with a new one, and your buddy's like, man, I heard you got a new car. And you're like, yeah, dude, it's 10 times better than that old one, man. You got to see it. This is what's going on. It's not like they were exactly 10 times fatter. They were exactly 10 times. No, what he's saying is, man, they were way smarter. They were way better off. Doing it God's way leaves us way better off. And Satan does everything he can to keep us from believing that. Daniel believed it. He couldn't be bought. He stood, and he would end up being used by the sovereign God in an amazing way.